Yeah, I'm not doing my talk today. I didn't
Okay,
finish preparing it and I didn't want to add too much time to it. So,
cool. Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited and humbled. I, th I forgot who reached out to me, but I think they saw a post on LinkedIn about some use effect. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, I saw that. I was like, oh wow, Nathan, he knows his stuff. He knows his stuff. Like we better hear from the man.
yeah, so I made yeah, I appreciate that. I made a prototype over the weekend for this demo. Can you see my second screen where it shows like the app?
Yeah.
Okay. So it doesn't look pretty, and the point of this is just to help us visualize re-renders. I don't know if everyone has it, the React developer tool Chrome extension. If you don't, I'd highly recommend it. When you download this and you install it, it gives you the ability to have this little component tab right up here, components tab. And in here inside the cog, if you hit the cogwheel and you click highlight updates when component renders, it gives you the ability to see every time a component re-renders. So it's very useful when you're trying to optimize things in React. But before I really go into the demo, I first wanted to cover just a few um, basic concepts in React. I guess I'll start off with a question. Why do we have React? Like, why is React cool? 'Cause I think it's not really talked about much, like why we even have React.
Like it's
Yes.
because of the
Anyone know?
virtual DOM, right?
Yeah, virtual DOM is definitely a part of it.
Yeah,
Before
that's what
React, the
makes it so
Facebook team,
efficient.
huh?
That's what makes it so efficient. That's why we
Yeah,
have React.
that's really cool. Yeah, I'm glad that you know about the virtual DOM because when before React existed, Facebook was encountering a lot of just issues where when you're using vanilla JavaScript and you're manipulating the DOM, literally anywhere in the application, it can change for no reason or some reason at all. And so they're encountering all these problems of trying to scale a really large application and manipulating the DOM. And so that's why they really push towards making React so that you can have deterministic views where you can encapsulate components, they can have their own state, and they can manipulate the DOM. And then the virtual DOM basically is just this big object in memory that holds all these key value pair or nodes of all of your components and the props that are in there. And it has algorithms to determine if things should re-render and stuff like that. So that's why React is really cool compared to like another framework like Angular. Angular does not have a virtual DOM. It uses like observables where it's similar, like where it has like this big object thing, and then like anything that changes in a certain part of it, it'll update a certain part. So it does its best, but it's still not. From what I've experienced and from what I've heard, it's not as fast as React. Vue also has a virtual DOM, but it kind of combines elements of like Angular and React. And it's the newer framework. It seems really cool. A lot of people are hyping about it. For me, the one thing that I don't like about it is that it's kind of like has like the directives, like similar to Angular, where you have like when you're iterating over data structures and you're spitting out, UI, it's like embedded in line in an HTML element, and it looks really weird and it's really awkward.
Yeah.
Um, the one thing I love and appreciate about React is it makes you a better JavaScript developer because everything is like JSX and it really forces you to learn filter, all the, like the most popular methods, like at least in JavaScript, like the dot map, dot filter, dot reduce. So I think overall it makes you a better JavaScript developer, React does. Anyways, so when we are passing props from a parent to a child in React, if it is a primitive, meaning a string, a Boolean, a number, that's completely fine. Like you don't really need to memoize it. Does everyone know what memoizing means? What do you guys think it means?
Like the isn't the classic or where I've seen it is when you're trying to do the Fibonacci sequence
Yeah,
using recursion, And it's this idea if we already know the value, then let's just store it in an object for fast lookup. Otherwise, we'll have to
Or
recompute.
top-down dynamic programming.
Awesome. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That's really the spirit of it, where you're basically caching values or work that's done, and only recomputing it when it needs to be under certain conditions. And React is heavily gives that responsibility to developers. And again, it's not really taught. Like memoization, it is taught, but you kind of have to be looking for it, I think. I feel like there's this gap that from what I've seen just on looking at classes on Udemy and on YouTube and stuff like that. So this idea is called reference or prop inequality, when you pass a prop to a component that is a non-primitive, meaning it's a function, it's an array, it's an object. And do you guys know what the difference between reference and value is?
Yeah.
Someone raise their hand?
Yeah, reference is like if you have an object in memory, you can copy it around, and that's using it by value or referring to like the specific value that exists in the memory, or you can refer to the place in memory that exists. So for an object, if you pass it into a function, you're telling the function where that object is rather than just giving it the whole object inside memory.
See if I can find a quick picture for this. I should have prepared this, but exactly. So like going more along with that, when you declare like a const, some variable is equal to something, the compiler is making an address in memory, and it's in hexadecimal, right? And the reference is the address of what is in memory, and then the value is like your string, your array, your object, or wherever it is, right? That's the value. So what React does is that by default, it typically, like when you're using like react.memo, and I'll explain more of these things, or use memo, or for class components like a pure component, it is just checking the references between all the props. So for a class component, when it extends like a pure component, what that does is it implements the should components update lifecycle method for you, and it compares the previous and next props and determines if it should re-render or not. And in the same vein, for functional components, react.memo is the exact same thing, but for functional components. But say like you have a child, and have you ever seen this before? Like where you pass like sum on change like thing, and like you do like a callback function like this. Have you ever seen this before? So you kind of want to avoid this, because what's happening is every time the parent re-renders, it's going to pass in a new reference or a new function every single time to the child. And so it's not memoized. And so every time the parent re-renders, the child's going to re-render too. And the same thing goes for like if you were to pass in like some array.map or I think .find is okay, because I believe, I checked the docs, .find returns the value and it doesn't change the reference. But when you do .map, .filter, .reduce, those things return a new object, a new array every single time, which is a new reference. So right there, we're going to break reference or prop inequality there. So these are things you have to be looking out for. Again, here's another thing. You see how I'm passing in an object right here? If you were to pass in like an object where you have like the two, curly braces, you're passing in a new object every single time. So again, you're breaking prop inequality there.
So even if it's intuitively to us, it seems like the same object, it still has to iterate all the way through and check each key and value, or in an array, it has to check every index of the array continuously.
Yeah, so like I don't even think React even tries. It's like it just checks the reference, right? So immediately it's going to say oh, the reference changed, there's a new address in memory, so okay, you're going to re-render too, right? So the thoughts that you were going through, that's the reason why React doesn't do this for objects and arrays, because just imagine if we had an array with like 10,000 elements in length, right? Do we really want React to iterate through that entire thing every single time to check to make sure all the values are the same and compare it to the previous one?
No.
So you're gonna run into performance issues just in that in and of itself, right? So React doesn't have the responsibility. They give the responsibility to us, right? So they say, no, you pass in the prompt and you memoize the stuff that you're passing into it. Okay, so now we're going to move into the demo. So what all this is that we have two different forms. One form is hooked up to, they're both looking at Redux. Do you guys are familiar with Redux? Maybe we can quickly cover this.
Familiar
Explain what it
with,
is.
not comfortable with, but
Okay.
familiar.
So basically what Redux is the big global object that holds state. And it has an API or APIs where you could connect a component regardless of where it is in the DOM, in the tree, and connect straight into a value or values that you pass into it. And it automatically memoizes those values for you when you're passing it in. It's through something called the connect function, or if you're going to use a hook, you use something called useSelector, which I'll show you guys too. So there's two different parts. So if you come over here, this is another dev extension tool called Redux or React Redux, or just search it somewhere on Chrome. But it gives you this tab for Redux. So I have two different parts of state. One is called Form 1 and Form 2. Form 1 is right here being visualized. Form 2 is over here. But these two different forms, the implementations are different. And I'm going to dive in and show you just performance issues. So, okay, we got our React dev tool working. So now you see every time I'm typing here how every single input field is being re-rendered. You see that?
Oh, because it's in orange.
It is in orange. You see that?
Yeah.
So let's multiply this problem by, let's see, let's do 350 input fields. Right. There's a huge lag. Oh gosh. Okay, there we go. So what's happening, right, is every 350 fields are trying to get re-rendered to the DOM, right? So we're encountering some DOM issues here, manipulating it too fast. So I have this little checkbox going, all that this does is for every input field, it's gonna wrap it in react.memo, where it's gonna compare the previous and next props and determine if it needs an update. So let's do that. And you can see it helps solve the issue, right? So the form, the big parent component is re-rendering, but just this field, if you can see that, just this field is being re-rendered, right? But it's still not optimal because we're still iterating over all these things. And the React.memo is determining if these things should all should re-render, right? So if we were to multiply this by 1,000 times, React.memo is not enough. It's going to cause problems. And I understand that this is probably not likely. We're probably not going to look at a form that has 1,000 fields, but it's to illustrate this point where, so you can see like it's lagging, even though we're wrapping everything in React.memo. What I've done here with Redux is that I've completely isolated each input field and they're atomic, meaning like they don't know what's next to them. They don't know about their siblings. And this one they do. They're dependent on each other, but this one they're not. They're hooking straight into one of these. And anytime the values in one of here changes, it changes. Let me show you. You see how only that field is re-rendering? Not the form, not the parent, not anything else. Yeah. And you can see right here how it's looking in the field too in the store. So I'm going to show you what this looks like in code now. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yeah, so each one of these input fields has its own, what is it, the Redux flow of having a action dispenser, or,
yeah.
or what do they call it?
Yeah.
An action and an updater.
Yeah, so the one thing that's also really nice about Redux is that it has a very strict contract of actions and reducers. So if you look at Redux, this is just me building like the little part of state, right? It has this is its default state. I made some little helper function to generate all those random fields and stuff, like, so you don't really need to worry about that. But you can see how, this is how it basically works. You have a reducer. It has some default state, and there's an action that's fired, and it's looking for an action type. And I built this object, so here's my action type. So I just have 3 of them, right? 1 to handle every input field change. 1, 2 for those little checkbox for the memorize input field, and the other one is for me changing the amount, the number of input fields, that little drop down that I showed you. So those are the only 3 actions that I have. And what a reducer's job? So an action, basically, its responsibility is to have some type of payload that's given to it from a component and then pass that in to a reducer. The reducer's job is to listen for an action type, and when an action type is valid, it manipulates or changes the state, its little state in Redux. So what this one, let's look at the on-form change. So I'm passing in the form key and the field key. So the form key is like form 1 or form 2. Do you guys remember that, where it had form 1 and form 2 and had like the 1,000 different input fields in each of those? So that's what form 1 is, right? So I'm passing that in from the action, which is here. And then I'm also, the payload is the actual value of whatever I'm typing or selecting from an inputs perspective. And so the field key is like field -0, field -1, right? And so right here, it's manipulating that part in state. So let me just switch back real quick so it kind of like makes sense. Whoops, that's the wrong screen, sorry. So if you look over here, so here's form 2, that's the field key. Sorry, the reducer key, and then this is the field key. So like when I'm typing in here, it's passing into that action form 2 for the reducer key, and then the field key 2 as the field key. So it knows to update this little part in the Redux. Okay. Sorry. Redux, like initially when you're learning it, it's a little confusing, but I feel like it doesn't need to get too complicated. You just need to know that just the different responsibilities, that actions call reducers and reducers update state. And then you have a way to hook into that state and get values from that state with an API that I'll show you guys. Okay, so here's just like the kind of like the top level of my component. Just here's the app, and I have all my stuff rendered in here. But we're gonna first look at the first form, the one that uses state, right? So this is the connect function in Redux. It's down here. It accepts, so we were passing in 2 different parameters in this function. One is called map state to props and map dispatch to props. All this is doing is map state to props is I'm diving into forms, which is the first reducer. I'm getting the first key inside of that object called form 1, and I'm getting these other values too inside of the reducer, and I'm passing it in as a prop into my component. Is everyone familiar with functional components? Yeah, okay. So this right here, I'm just destructuring the props. So here, does everyone know what destructuring is? Sorry. Hopefully, okay. It's like one of the coolest things about JavaScript. So yeah, so you can see here, you see how these things are coming in from Redux right here. I'm passing them in here. So those props are coming from. It's coming from Redux. This connect function is the thing that memoizes these values for me. So anytime these values change, it's going to cause a re-render for my component. And then I have the map dispatch to props in a similar way. Instead of state that's from Redux, it's an action. I'm passing in an action as a prop to my component, so I can call it like this. So this handle on form change, this is the action that we saw over here, right? So I'm passing in this action or this function as a prop to my component, because what happens is that we need a dispatch object or API to be wrapped around this to be able to actually interact with the Redux reducer. And that's kind of happening behind the scenes. I'm not going to go into much detail there, but that's basically what's happening behind the scenes, is that it's this map dispatcher prop is making this action a prop, and it's also wrapping it and exposing the dispatch API so it can actually call it reducer and pass the data to it. All right, so here is like the render method. So okay, I got my form 1, right? So that's the form one that has all those fields. It has like those 1,000 input fields in it, right? I'm just iterating over it. I'm getting the entries, which is the keys and the values, right? Every key and value that's inside of the form one. And I'm getting, here, I'm making input props, and I'm basically right here, I'm passing in an input. So here's my 1,000 basic inputs, or depending on if I select that checkbox or not, I'm actually going to memoize it, or I'm going to just render a basic one. So all this little helper component does, I'll show you guys real quick. All this thing is doing is like you pass in the component and all the props, and it's just wrapping it in React.memo right here. So it's just memoizing it's just a higher order component that you can pass any component into it, and it just wraps it with React.memo. That's all it's doing. And in the case of the form with Redux, like connect, it doesn't matter if we memoize it or not, because again, every single field is going to be isolated, which I'll show you in a minute. So does this, I'm sorry, this might not make a whole lot of sense. Is everyone confused what's going on here? So we got this form one from Redux, we're mapping over it, and we're going to spit out JSX down here, right? For every form key that's in there, I'm getting all the props that I need to be passed to my input, my basic input component, which is handling like if it's a text field, if it's an option or select, if it's a file or a checkbox, all that stuff. That's what's being handled into here. We don't need to look at the details of that. Does that all make sense? Good.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the reason why this thing is not optimal. It's because my reducer is changing one value inside this huge form one object. And so anytime that happens, it's going to return a new object based on what my reducer is doing. And it's going to cause this component to re-render and do all this work again. Right? It's going to have to iterate over it all again, and it's going to have to do this. And so there's two different things. There's iteration, and then there's manipulating the DOM. We already saw that when we memoized the basic component right here, it helped when we had about 350 inputs, right? But once we got to 1,000, right, we're encountering an iteration problem, right? Where we're iterating through the thing that's really large, and we are memoizing them. So for every 1,000, for every input field, it's memoized. So it's going to check all these props. It's going to check every single reference for these, determine if it needs to re-render. That's a lot of work, right? Because you can see like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 props. And so 8 times 1,000, that's 8,000 checks that it's going to have to do, right? To determine if it needs the re-render or not for every input field. Are you guys following me?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work that's being done. So now I'm going to switch over to the second form, which is the one that's that hooks just straight into Redux. I'm going to show you this. So this is the higher order component. This is where the form is, right? This is like the outer one, and here's the inputs inside of here. I'm using a hook that Redux has. What this thing does, it's very similar to the connect function where you can get the state and you grab all the values that you want. But what's nice about it is it gives you the ability to implement your own equality function. So what this allows me to do is memoize the work that this thing is going to do. And I can isolate the specific conditions that I want this work to be done. And all the work that is going to be done is, so anytime this only happen. So sorry, let me back up. So you guys know we're like in that drop down where I can change like 100 or 350 inputs, right? That's going to change the length of the keys inside the Redux store, right? It's going to go from 100 to 350, etc. And so those are the only conditions. That's like the one condition that I want for this work to be redone, because I want those things to be rendered to the DOM, right? So that's one condition that I want. The other condition is, that little checkbox that I had for memoize input fields. I also want to know if that thing changed. So right there, I just narrowed it down to just only 2 conditions, specific conditions that I want all this work to be done, where I'm rendering all these components to the DOM. That's why this thing's so fast, because that only happens once. In the previous one, every time I type into a field, it's going to do that iteration every single time, and I can't avoid that, right? But with this, I am, because I'm memoizing it. I'm setting this very specific conditions where I want that work to be recomputed. So all this thing is similar to like what was done in the other one, where here's my memoize, and it doesn't really matter if it's memoized or not because these things are isolated. But these are the two things that we want to focus on. So I'm passing in a prompt to this thing called a reducer key, right? Remember the form 2 inside of the Redux? So I want it to be looking for that. And then the field key, which is like field -0, field -1, field -2, etc. And that's it. And so now now when I go to this component, there's two parameters inside of map state to props. The first one is I'm destructuring the big object, the big global state object. I'm grabbing the forms. So let me show you. Actually, I think it'll be better if I show you the other screen. It's kind of unintuitive when you're just looking at code. Okay. So here's my state. Has one object in it called forms. That form object has two other objects in it, or three other objects in it, and all this other stuff. What I'm doing is I'm passing in form 2 because I want it to look for this. And for every field, I'm also passing in the field key for every one of those inputs, right? So let's go back to the code and see if you guys can follow that. You see I'm passing in form 2 because I want it to look for form 2. And then I'm passing in every field key, which is coming from this form 2 object that I got from my use selector, which is like connect. So I'm basically grabbing that object form 2, I'm iterating over it, and I'm passing in the reducer key for my other component, which is this, so that I can get the value right here. So what I'm doing is I'm doing state dot forms dot form 2 dot whatever the field key is, right? That's field -0, field -1. Is everyone following?
Right.
So right here, what it's doing is it's only grabbing the props, just that little part, that one little field in Redux, and that's all that it cares about. And anytime that changes, it's gonna re-render. But all the other ones are isolated because they all have different field keys, right? They're all looking at different little parts of the state. So if we go back, the way that, what I'm doing is, you see me on the screen? Okay. What I'm doing is like all these fields are directly linked up to each one of these things. And this is their whole world. That's all they care about. They're abstracted from one another. They don't know that they're siblings. All they know is like, hey, I'm looking at this very specific part in Redux and that's all I care about. I don't care about this huge other big state object that has all these other fields. I don't care about that. I am only concerned about what lies in this very specific part of Redux. Do you guys see that?
Yeah.
And so what I've done is I've isolated all the fields from one another. They don't know about, all they care about is this field. This guy, field 2, all he cares about is this thing right here. Because what I've done is
it didn't follow your, I still see the code.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Let me share the second screen. That would have helped. Sorry, guys. So you see, all this guy is concerned about is this little part in the store, right? This guy, on the other hand, when I type into here, really slow, right? This guy's dependent on that huge thing that iterates over all these other things, right? And gets rendered to the DOM. Where even if we memoize it, it doesn't matter because we're still encountering that iteration problem where we have to map over this huge data structure and it has to, all the input fields are memoized, yes, but that has a lot of work because you're multiplying the work done 8 times 1,000, right? So for every field, it's gonna have to check those 8 props that I'm passing into every input field and determine if the references have changed for every one, right? And so you're gonna encounter some lag issues, but in this one, it's gonna be smoother. Okay.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions so far? I'm not losing my voice. I need water.
Yeah. So this power of isolation, of everything being its own little kind of component, subcomponent that doesn't care about anything else, that power is coming from the combination of both Redux and the use selector hook.
Yes. So let's go back. So when I'm iterating over that data structure, that big form, that form 2 that has that 1,000 different keys in there, right? I'm isolating that work that's done to only two conditions. One condition is if the field lengths change, or if I selected the Boolean checkbox if I want to memorize the components or not. That's it. So this work is only done very rarely, much more rarely than the other one where it's going to happen every single time I type into an input field. The previous one, this work is done every single time I type into an input field.
Right.
This iteration. But on this one, it's only done when these things change. And this is really easy for it to check. It's really easy to evaluate if a lengths are different, right? Or if a Boolean is different. That's not that much work, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've isolated that work of initially rendering all those input fields to the DOM to just when those conditions change. And what I've done is I've passed in the specific keys from Redux for my component to look at so that it could utilize the connect function to use those props that you pass in to tap in to that specific spot in Redux. And that's all that it cares about. It doesn't care about anything else.
So hypothetically, you could get this this isolation and this great efficiency without Redux and just doing it a normal React app, no Redux, but still using the use selector. And then you would just have that ternary use selector. If the use selector has changed, then we'll re-render. Otherwise, we'll just stay put, which gives us that efficiency. I guess the question is Redux essential to this efficiency?
No, and that's a great question. So like, if you guys aren't familiar, React now has a use context API and a use reducer API. Use reducer actually is very similar to Redux. It's funny how Redux has affected the development of React. It's actually it's like almost exactly the same. But you basically can make a provider which holds like state similar to Redux, and you can allow other components to map to you to consume that provider and get the values that that provider gives. The problem with that is that again, it encounters this issue because anytime the state in the provider changes, every single component that's mapped into that's hooking into it through the use context API is going to re-render. It's going to consider it because the difference is the connect function doesn't. The connect function will not cause the component to re-render because it memoizes it for you. It does a lot of like stuff in the background. But one thing that I will say is, yes, there is probably a way where you can make a state, right? You can use state, make a big object, and you could pass in, yeah, so you can do something similar that I've done here. I think you could. You can do something very similar like this, where you can have this big state object, you do some JSX where you render a whole bunch of stuff, but you just pass those things that you want your components to hook directly into, a very specific part of the state that you defined. And then right here, you can memoize it, but you wouldn't use selector. You'd use something called use memo. I actually, I forgot to mention this, the reason why I didn't do this, but here, I guess since you asked a question, let me see if I can make something real quick. I'll do something that's very pseudocode. So you can do something like const state, oops, set state is equal to use state. You can use that hook, define it as key 1, key 2, etc. right? And then what you can do is you can do const render something to the DOM is equal to use memo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do object dot entries. I'm going to pass in state, right? So I'm going to map over, I'm going to grab every single key value in here, dot map key value. There's my key, my value. So there's that. And then I can do some component and I can pass in from here the key. Actually, I wouldn't want to do the value because now I'm thinking about it, because it needs I still don't think this would work, because anytime the state changes, it's still this work is going to have to be done, because how is the component now going to get the value? The key is fine, but how is it going to get the value, right? How is it going to hook into this? It has to have a reference to the state, right? You see the predicament? This component is going to have some reference to the state object. And that's what the connect function for Redux solves. This connect function exposes to this component. It gives it the ability to have state, the whole state object. Does that make sense? So I'm glad I did that, even though I've kind of discovered for myself that it's not possible. I don't think it's possible. It might be. I'd have to think about it more. But that's
because now that will act as a choke point, right?
Yeah, like it's a choke point because it needs to have the reference to the state in order for it to grab the value. But once I do this, once I pass in the state this way, then I'm gonna have to. That's a dependency, right? So let's keep going. So here's my dependency array. Dependency array means like any value that's changed in here, this work is going to be recomputed. I would have to pass in state in here.
Oh, right.
Right? Yeah. Because even if I had some callback, right? So I had some on change and I passed in the set state, right? The set state is going to cause this thing to change and this thing is going to be dependent on it, right?
Yeah.
So no. I can't think of a way without Redux to do this. And maybe this is a great reason why we're discovering why Redux is awesome.
Yeah, well, you could check out the Flux architecture is what Redux is part of in React. It's kind of the thing, yeah. And there's like MobX is kind of like Redux. It fits into the Flux architecture the same way. So you could probably do like a super bare bones implementation of like the exact functionality you need from that kind of architecture yourself without really a huge amount of effort, but you basically be doing like a lame version of Redux.
Yep.
Kind of in that, yeah. So
and that's what I've seen too when I've read a lot of articles of people trying to do it. Honestly, I've done it myself. I've actually made like kind of like a Redux clone with the use context and the use reducer API, but it's not as good because like what I said earlier, anytime, even if you have a provider that provides some type of state, you're going to have some type of API, like either through a use reducer or through a set state, that's going to change that thing. And any child that's hooked into that, it's going to re-render it because it's going to detect that change. But the magic of Redux is that it doesn't let the component update if things that are returned from the map state to props doesn't change, right? It only re-renders if this changes. So
interesting.
That's what's really nice about Redux is it does that work for you. But like what Paul said, you could, I guess, do it. But at that point, why reinvent the wheel?
Right. So for you, despite all these new tools and the other ones mentioned, to you, Redux is still kind of like the gold standard for state management?
I would say so. I don't think it's going away. I would say that it's not required for every single project. What the reasons why you want to use Redux is if you have a lot of components that are separated throughout the DOM and they're distant from each other, but they want to share similar type of state from one another. That's what connect function does, is it allows you to map straight into this global state object, grab the values that you want, regardless of where it is in the tree, in the DOM.
Yeah, that is powerful.
That's super powerful. So this is the problem inherently within React is something called prop drilling, where you have a parent that passes in a ton of props to child, and that just turns into a huge bloat mess, and it's terrible. So the context API helps that, and Redux helps that API. But Redux, I would still say, is better for more like, I would say if you're making a very simple application, it's probably not required. But for you guys, if you guys don't know Redux, I would highly recommend you learning it because it is the industry standard and everyone is using it.
Cool. Yeah. And this definitely helps understand why.
Yeah. And I have this on GitHub. I also sent in our Slack channel, like the the Heroku app version of it, so you guys can play with it yourself. I'll also post the link of it in the GitHub link, so you guys can check it out and clone it and play around with it for yourselves if you guys want.
Great.
Cool.
But yeah,
Thanks,
I really
Nathan.
appreciate you guys' time. You guys have any other questions? I know I've kind of gone over time. I'm sorry.
It's fine.
No, don't worry. That was great. That was really interesting and very cool of you to put all of that work in over the weekend just for this. So really appreciate it.
I kind of did it twofold. I did it one because I want to make a YouTube video about this. Two, kind of doing this partially for work where we use forms very heavily, and I'm figuring out an architectural solution for Redux to use it. And I think I'm on the way, really well on the way for that. So yeah, so we're knocking out a couple birds with one stone. So, but yeah, I really appreciate it.
Nice. Thanks.
Thanks.
Very good.
I'm gonna stop the recording.
Yeah, that was